You're listening to the Home Staging Show podcast. I'm your host, Cindy Lin. This is a show where we talk about all things real estate, home staging, and selling your home to live and to sell. Welcome back to Season 9. This is Episode 3. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode and to the Episode 3 of Season 9. So this is really exciting, I have to tell you. So as of last Friday, this podcast turned 4 years old. And we're almost at 100,000 downloads. So that is huge. I know number-wise, we're a small show. Somebody like a Tim Ferriss does more than that in one episode. But it's quite an achievement, and it's given me so much on a personal and professional level throughout this last 4 years. My life's changed a lot as well. Stage Rumors changed a lot as well. So I want to thank you for those of you who have been listening, downloading, and leaving reviews. It really helped us grow the show, and I really appreciate you. And on the show today, I have a fellow podcaster, Stacy Grinsfelder, on the show. Her podcast is True Tales from Old Houses. So she owns an 1880s fixer-upper that is a DIY dream that she did not know she ever wanted. But here Stacy is, paintbrush in hand, and marveling at the fact that this beauty is her family's. Some days she feels more like a caretaker than the owner. Even so, her family home is not a museum. They live there. She strives to inspire others, preserve older homes, respect their irreplaceable craftsmanship, and adapt modern living to those treasures of the past. I really had a great time interviewing Stacy. She has such a great energy, and she's a wealth of knowledge when it comes to old homes. And her blog, the Blake Hill House BHH blog, is chock full of restoration education, DIY tutorials, and before and afters. The True Tales from Old Houses podcast is available on most podcast listening platforms and the BHH blog. Her co-host, Devin Colwell, lends his voice to the bi-weekly conversation. So without further ado, let's start the show. So hi, Stacy. So great to have you on the show. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how did you get into restoring and renovating old houses?
Yes. First, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I'm very excited. My journey into old home ownership, DIY restoration it's actually fairly recent, especially when you're talking in historical times. A lot of people come into this thinking they love old homes, that's all they want. But I came in a different way. My husband and I had been looking for a house for, 6 months probably. And I was pretty convinced that I wanted a move-in ready home. We had lived in a house in our prior town where we did a lot of renovation work, and I just wasn't sure that I wanted to do it again. But after about 6 months, we weren't finding what we were looking for. Houses that were move-in ready were way out of our price range. And my husband had begged me to come and look at this fixer-upper. And for months, I told him, no, I'm not even going to look. I don't want any part of this. It's going to be a dump. It's just going to cost way too much to fix. I want no part of it. Well, after months of looking, he convinced me that we would just breeze through this house very quickly, and then it would all be over. And I figured, well, I'll make him happy, and I will tell him no anyway. But the moment I walked into this house, I just fell in love. When you walk in the front door, there's a beautiful old staircase with Greek key accents on the side. It has a landing with a Juliet balcony and a curved banister up at the top. And within 5 minutes, I knew this was the house for us.
Yeah, so it was really a love at first sight, it sounds like.
It absolutely was. The house was a bit of a time warp, like most old houses can be in some ways. But the more I looked at the details and the craftsmanship of this house, I realized that it was worth preserving and restoring instead of changing. So some of those things that I saw at a first glance, the longer I stayed here, the more I fell in love with them and respected the craftsmanship that was required to create them.
That's amazing. And so now that you've been through it, what and how should someone prepare for when they're buying an old home?
Yeah, that's a really important question. People buy old homes for different reasons. Sometimes, like me, the old house is in their price range. That happens a lot in towns where the only thing you can afford is the old house. Other people are looking for a fixer-upper, and other people are already in love with old houses. So I would say, if I wanted to give somebody advice about buying an old house, I would say, be prepared for setbacks and be prepared to be flexible and to know that the end result of your home purchase may not be perfection. There will always be quirks in old houses.
So I'm just curious, just when you buy a house, you do a home inspection, right? So
Right.
was there anything else that happened afterwards that wasn't covered in the home inspection and you were surprised by?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a home inspection for an old house can be very different than a home inspection for new construction, or newer construction, I should say. Not everybody's buying a brand new house. But when you have a newer house, there's this expectation that all systems will be functioning and in place, and nothing's going to happen to your house when you move in, no surprises. That's generally what people are trying to avoid, surprises. With an old house, we're talking about systems that can be well over 100 years old. So a home inspector, kind of the key to a good home inspection is knowing what your expectations are at the end of the inspection. So if your expectations are that the inspector is going to tell you this house is in perfect condition and you don't have to spend any money making it any better, then an old home might not be the right house for you. Typically what happens is it's a toss-up. Your inspector is going to tell you something like, well, the foundation's good, but you need a new roof. Or the roof and the foundation are great, the structure's great, there's lead paint all over, or there's asbestos in the basement. And it's all about determining where your comfort zone is. And sometimes with an old house, there is no negotiation. You're accepting what you're getting, and you're choosing to move forward with your purchase, knowing that there will be work for you to do.
That's amazing. I really love that you hit different points in terms of inspection, because I think that is something people really need to understand when they're buying an older home. There are going to be unexpected things that may happen, and they need to have that expectations managed.
Yeah, I think you're right. Something that can help with old houses, or actually, I'll tell you what, any house in general, is to know what you're getting. So know if you're getting septic or city water, and know if you're getting radiators or forced air heat, and know exactly what you're getting into. That can help you decide whether the bills are going to be too high for you or what kind of maintenance will be required afterwards. Knowing what you're getting into is half the battle with moving into any house, and an old house as well.
And how does modern day living clash with living in an older home?
Well, as I mentioned, there are quirks. So sometimes old houses don't have things like, proper shower or proper lighting or even electricity that activates with a wall switch. That's what we found it out for sure. So it's not as convenient sometimes as a new house. So modern life clashes. Well, I guess I'll give you a real life example. The lady who lived here before us had moved in the 60s, lived here as a single woman, didn't have any kids. I'm sorry, she wasn't single. She was married, but they lived here without any children. And then she lived here until she passed away when she was in her 90s. So that was when we bought the house in 2014. She didn't have any showers in the house. There were no laundry hookups. And I have, at the time, 3 teenage boys and a daughter, and we needed a shower. So, of course, we created that as a priority and had to convert one of the closet tubs into a shower. So you have to be willing to deal with things that are sometimes less than ideal, especially if it's not in your budget to go right in and fix things right away.
So in situations like that, obviously when you bought the house, you renewed the floor plan. Was that something you budget for to convert the tub into the shower as soon as you can?
Yeah, and that's a matter of priorities, and everybody's priorities are going to be different. So for some people, fixing the kitchen is going to be the highest priority. For other people, fixing the bathroom is going to be the high priority. For some people, fixing the driveway is going to be, for whatever, paving the driveway will be the most important thing on their list. And that's very individual. One thing I would say to people when they're looking at their house is that it's very tempting to rush right in and immediately start remodeling things to make it better for you or make it more aesthetically pretty. Oftentimes it's just because we want a prettier house. But my friend, I have a friend, his name is Scott Seidler, and he's a restoration and preservation worker. And he gave me this term called the house sandwich. And the house sandwich is basically your roof and your foundation are the bread. And everything in between is sort of, what you would put in your sandwich, your meat, your cheese, your pickles, your ketchup, your mustard, whatever. And you have to have a good roof and a good foundation before you really start working on the interior. Because often what happens is if you go right in and you start immediately remodeling something, if your roof's leaking, it's probably just going to get damaged again. If your foundation is sinking, then you're probably just going to have damage again. So to prevent you from having to do it twice, it's very important to make sure that your roof and your foundation are in good condition and that your house, generally on the outside, leak-free, and then feel free to just enjoy yourself. There are people who have different budgets than I have. And those budgets include, I'm going to purchase the old house, and my budget includes completely remodeling, restoring the house. There are more people, I think, like me, who are getting into the house and then remodeling it as they can.
I love it. I love this house sandwich analogy. It's just perfect.
Yeah, when he told me that, I thought, exactly. I mean, it makes so much sense. And it was interesting, when we bought this house, there were a couple of big things that needed to be fixed right away. And one of those things was the roof. The roof was pretty bad. And the other thing was the electrical panel. We had a 60 amp panel for a 4,600 square foot house. And so both of those things were pretty dire, but also both of those things were very expensive. So we had to make a decision. And along with our insurance agent, they said, okay, here's the deal. You need to get the electric upgraded right now because that's just a safety issue. And then we're going to go ahead and insure this house, but we would like you to have the roof done within, I think it was 18 months. And so we thought, okay, we can do that. And that's how we negotiated that problem of having two big things that needed to be fixed, but budgeting for them in a different way.
I think that is brilliant. And I love that your insurance agent was able to have a conversation with you on this to really help you with that decision process.
Yeah, it's very important to have some pretty frank discussions with your insurance agent about the insurance they'll provide, what they're seeing. You don't want to get in a situation where you get insurance without that conversation and then something happens and they say, oh, we're not covering that. No surprises. You can't eliminate every surprise. That's part of the joys of any home ownership. But you can mitigate those risks by just communicating in the beginning.
That's very, very important. I'm really glad that you brought up these points because I think that is something that we normally don't really think about when we're buying a house. And I think you're right in terms of the house sandwich. Most of the times we are thinking what goes into the middle part. We don't really think about the roof or the foundation. It's really about how can I make this house look prettier or upgrading the bathroom so I can have a really luxurious spa experience or, any kind of, experience kind of things. But it's not really necessary the practical things.
Right. It's true. I can't say that I'm everybody's favorite because I am practical first. But I will say after living in this house for 5 years, we're making it pretty too. It's just a matter of arranging the tasks in the proper order so that you're not doing work twice.
And I'm just curious, how did your children react when you told them that this is a house that you bought and there was no shower?
Actually, it's kind of funny. I don't think they even noticed that. So I guess I should say again, I have 3 teenage boys and boys, they're a different beast. So we took baths for a while and that was fine. But an interesting story was that we ended up seeing this house with 2 of the boys, just the way childcare worked out that day. And they happened to be with me and we walked in the house and one of my sons, he whispered in my ear, he said, I really want to live here. He knew instantly too, the same thing that I was feeling, that this was a good house for us.
That's amazing. And so when you're doing restorations and renovation of your home, are you choosing traditional materials or are you adding in like the new technology or new materials as well? Because I'm imagine with sourcing could be an issue because some of the older standard sizes might be out of rotation already. They might become discontinued.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And part of it is a commitment to the learning process. When you're doing DIY and restoration work, you're kind of doing trade-offs to decide what's important to you when you're fixing things and restoring things. And that's a little different for everyone too. Let's go back to my staircase that I mentioned in the beginning. It's an irreplaceable staircase. In fact, I feel like I should send you a picture or something. But when it comes to that staircase that to replace would be, I couldn't even imagine. It would be tens of thousands of dollars to replace the staircase and everything in it. So to that end, the restoration work that I do on that staircase I will spend my money there. I will spend my money asking an artisan to recreate a piece that's broken. But when it comes to other things, there are places where there's some wiggle room. You can use something that's in stock and modify it in a way that at least looks old, that respects the craftsmanship in the home, even if it's not exact.
Yeah, and I think you're right in terms of the learning process of it, because I think you do have to evaluate what is the trade-off. Because I know a lot of renovators, they do want to respect the older traditions and then kept with the older architectural details, but sometimes realistically, they may not be able to do that just simply because the material is no longer there or it just doesn't really fit with modern day living.
Right, for sure. I'm always looking for products that are modern products that perform and make my house look like it would when it was originally built. An example of that would be, we just refinished the floors on the first floor. And of course, like I said, the house is 4,600 square feet. I think it was about 1,400 square feet that we refinished. And that was an important part of the house. It's all throughout. So it's the first thing you see, you notice it. I wanted it to be as perfect as possible. But old finishes were not ideal. That's the reason we were in the mess that we were in. A lot of people had put modern finishes over old finishes, and those had failed because they don't adhere to each other. And I was able to find a product that's a completely modern product. It's out of Belgium, I believe. I didn't buy it from Belgium. It's available in the United States, but it was created in Belgium. And it completely mimics what an original style floor would look like, but it's a modern product. I live in a cold area, so it will perform with road salt, and it will perform with dirty shoes and dogs and kids and traffic. And so I thought that was a win-win. I got floors that looked old, but I was able to use a modern product that replicated that.
Yeah, and because it's a modern day product, you can get replacement if you need to. Like if you need the finishes wear off and you get more, you can.
Exactly.
So how long did it take for you to find that particular product?
Well, it's funny, I don't really time myself when it comes to these things. A lot of times I kind of put things on a list. So for instance, I knew the floors were going to be coming up this year, and I've known we needed to do the floors for probably 15 months. So I just started the process of, in some ways, just paying attention. What's available, what's out there, kind of eliminating the things that I didn't want. There were certain looks that I didn't want. So I knew that product wasn't going to work. And then I knew what I needed or how I needed it to perform. And just being kind of open to that information and paying attention and, spending time in some forums of other people who own old houses and Instagram, and it just kind of came to light. And I thought, wow, that might be the product for us, the one that I found. And then I called the company. So it's not like I'm spending 15 months researching a product. And I don't think anybody really needs to do that. There's some people who love that. There are some people who just can't get enough research. They research. Me, I'm more like, the faster I could find this, the better. But just keeping open to what's out there and then spending my time researching things that might be the right fit is generally the way I go about it.
And I'm also curious too, because sometimes older floor plans are actually really difficult for modern day living. So have you actually changed any of the floor plans since you moved in?
We have not changed the floor plan. Sometimes you're right. Sometimes previous modifications have made floor plans awkward. There were some trends mid-century where spaces were closed off so you didn't have to heat as much, or all the ceilings were lowered, those kinds of things that people would like to undo. There's also the trend of watching programs on TV where everybody gets an open floor plan and people are very attached to that idea. I want an open floor plan too. Again, that's sort of a comfort level. I tend to, the house that we live in, like I said, it was sort of a time warp as far as decor goes, but not much had changed in here. And even though there are things that would be nice, like, I don't need a butler's pantry anymore. We leave them intact because they work okay. But actually, I have a better example of that. Let me use an example of that. So I live in a town where there's a ton of old house inventory. And a lot of these houses predated even indoor plumbing. So when indoor plumbing was added, they put the bathrooms on the second floor for whatever reason. I don't know why. So there are actually houses. In fact, we had a rental house when we first moved here. Beautiful. It was, somebody had done a ton of work on it, but the only bathroom, or the first bathroom, I guess, was on the second floor. So when you're young and spry, that's okay. When you have guests over for dinner, it's awkward. So those are things that are probably worth considering changing. And it's a smart idea. Bathroom on the first floor is a modern convenience. And I don't see why we should live completely in the past.
I think that's a really good point. And I'm going to make a guess why it's on the second floor. It's because water pressure for flushing.
Oh, you're probably right. Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure.
Because I lived in Europe for a little bit and a lot of old plumbing was like that. And actually, even in modern day, some of the toilets you see in Europe, there's actually a step up when you walk into the bathroom. Like the toilet is on the step up. And it has to do with the water pressure issue.
Right. Yeah, that's probably true. I also thought maybe it was a privacy issue. At the time, like people just didn't go to the bathroom at other people's houses, whereas, we're just not that way. We're so much more casual than we were when these houses were built.
Yeah, because remember in Victorian times, it was considered scandalous if a woman were to show her ankle. Remember? And then
Yes.
actually why the door swing a certain way was for privacy reason. So that if you pass by and then it happened, the door opened, they can't see inside the room. So it actually had it actually had historical meaning behind even why the door was positioned a certain way. It's for modesty.
Right. And you bring up a good point. That's part of the fun of owning an old house, is looking at the quirks. And sometimes we ask ourselves, like, why in the world would they have built it this way? But once you do a little research, or you just spend some more time in the house, you realize that they thought of everything that was possible to think of at that time. A good example of that is windows, for instance. We have windows all over the house. We don't have air conditioning. And I live in an area where that's actually okay. We don't have air conditioning. It was predated electricity. So there were windows everywhere so everyone could see, all the windows open, ventilation. If you see a modern house now, there might be a whole side of a house with just, two tiny windows because they don't need those windows anymore. They have air conditioning, forced air, everything they need is right there. It was built into the house. But the volume of windows and the way things were put together, they were put together that way for a reason. And sometimes knowing that reason is enough to encourage a homeowner to preserve it.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's such a good point, actually, because when you mention even like air conditioning, it is true. I think modern day homes, we don't have as many windows because for us, if you have modern day heating or air conditioning, windows are basically huge energy suck. And that's why people build less and less windows. But thinking with older homes, like my grandmother's house too, like she had a lot of windows and the house was naturally cool. So it's actually probably much more eco-friendly the way they used to build houses, where they really put in a lot of thoughts and details. Whereas sometimes I work with new construction builders before, and I just felt like they just want to build as quick as possible so they can turn over the home and sell it to the next project. actually not as much thoughts have been put into how actually inhabitants will live. Like I recently lived in an apartment where it was very designy, but it wasn't really practical. Like for decoration reason, they put in all the angles in the home, for example. But the thing is, like, then there's no storage space because the cabinets would be cut off in weird angles. And so it actually limit a lot of practical reasons, like how you can live in this space. Like it was cool looking, but it was not functional in terms of living there.
Right, right. Yeah, and even the way a house was situated and oriented on a piece of property mattered because they were taking advantage of the light, what you'd need in the morning versus what you'd need at night. And is it going to be hot in the summer for sleeping or whatnot? Just they thought of all those things, whereas those don't matter in a new construction so much. It's just a matter of how the whole subdivision might be laid out or, what's I don't know. There's so many factors, I guess, that were involved in choosing how, where, and which way to face old houses versus new construction.
Right. And so when you're working on restoration and renovation, how do you determine your budget and timeline?
Well, I think like anyone, when I first moved in, my timeline, I didn't give myself enough time. I figured that just like TV, things must go very quickly. And if they weren't going quickly, then I must be doing something wrong. But experience changes those thoughts, and you realize that everything takes longer than you think it will take. You have an idea. I'm certainly getting better at figuring out how much time things will take and planning our lives around those projects. As far as the budget goes, and that's super individual for everyone who's doing it. We have times during the year where we have a lump sum of money that we can spend on things. And so we tend to, at the first of the year, decide what we want to do and what needs to be done. So for instance, I'm always kind of inspecting the house to see what might be a dire need. So if I see something in the foundation that needs to be addressed, then that goes to the top of the list, even though I'd really rather do something that's more cosmetic. And that's kind of a yearly basis. I'm looking at or paying attention to all the systems. So we budget for things that we have to have, and then we have a budget for things that we'd like to have. Sometimes that's not always possible. Like the first couple of years that we were in the house, we were basically we were living a little bit differently. We were spending large chunks of money on things like the roof, and we were spending a really big sum painting the exterior of the house to keep it standing. Those were really important things. We're less at those big ticket items now, but we do hold back some money for things like, well, what if our furnace goes? Because our furnace has been in since the 1990s. So it's always kind of a balance between wants and needs.
Yeah, so it sounds like you do have a reserve just for the in case, emergency type of things.
We did, but I'll be honest, those first couple of years we did not. We bought this house and we owned a house in California where we lived before that didn't sell and didn't sell and didn't sell. So we were really, we went into this knowing exactly what we were getting into. We certainly weren't blind to it, but there was just a lot of positive thoughts and not a lot of money in the beginning.
Yeah, it is a challenge, but I think that your approach is very practical because you have a list, kind of in the back of your head what are some of the things you need to do, like you want to do, and some of the things were really nice to have. And so I think the prioritizing of it is very, very important.
Yeah, I think it's really kind of key in some ways. That keeps you from getting in that situation. I hang out in a lot of online forums for people who have old houses, and it always breaks my heart when somebody will move into an old house and then 6 months later say, something just collapsed and it's going to cost, $6,000 to fix, and I don't have $6,000. What am I supposed to do? And, things happen to everyone, and you just can't control everything. But going into it with a little reserve or an idea, what would I do if something like that happened? Having a plan, how would I cope with that? because it is a little different than when you buy a brand new house. You know, the expectation with a brand new house is that, or close to new, is that it's not going to collapse. And a lot of times there are things like home warranties that you can buy or get from, you know, in the purchase, or maybe you have negotiated some work with the seller, or you have some recourse. And sometimes with old houses, you really don't. You don't have that same recourse. You have basic recourse. So, you know, obviously if the seller lies about something and it comes back, then that's basic recourse. But, you know, you can't tell when your 130-year-old chimney's going to fall. Nobody knows that. Even an inspector doesn't know that. They are just doing their best.
Exactly. And so what are some of the important considerations when it comes to restoring and renovating homes?
There is a safety issue. Most houses, or all houses really, prior to, I believe, 1974, might be 1972, you can pretty much expect that there will be lead paint in there, maybe asbestos. Your inspector should mention something like that. That should be a complete surprise. If your inspector doesn't mention that, then you should kind of assume that there's going to be something in there. One thing that I always get a kick out of on the TV shows, I mention those a lot just because I watch them a lot and I enjoy them. I enjoy them just like anybody else. Is that usually, you know, when some hazard comes up, then the host of the show and the homeowner, you know, there's going to be, you know, we think we uncovered lead paint. And then everybody looks at each other and then cut to commercial. You know, it's this big drama-filled moment, like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen next, you know? But these don't have to be deal breakers. A lot of the old home hazards are only a hazard under certain situations. And a person who lives in an old home or works on an old home should know those hazardous situations, absolutely. And there are precautions to take, especially if you have little kids, pets. Yeah, you know, there are at-risk groups that should not be exposed to any of these things. So again, it's just another one of those, you know, analysis of what's important and what can we live with and how can we change it and do we have the money to change it and is it important? And there's kind of a direct link between, I find, the inventory of houses in your town. So for instance, I live in a town where probably, I would say 85% of the inventory are old houses. So none of those hazards are deal breakers for people because we all know they're going to be here. But I might move to a town out west where there's one old house, you know, say from the gold rush or some, you know, person during the Western expansion went out to open a general store for miners. And that house, if it's the only old one, then people are going to be a lot more critical of what's in it and what needs to be different because the rest of the inventory, they're kind of comparing it to what's around. There's no right or wrong here. I'm just kind of expressing the difference between areas, regional differences with house purchases.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Especially I wanted to laugh when you mentioned like the lead paint. I feel like ever since I went to college in early 2000, late 90s,
Right.
and I always get this disclosure, you know, like there might be lead in your wall paint. It's something that I feel like as a Californian you just get so used to because I think if your house is painted after 1950s or 60s, there are going to be lead in the paint. And it sounds horrible and very concerning, but chances are in modern day time, there's so many additional coats of paint on top of the lead paint. You're probably perfectly fine unless you're scraping off your wall and snorting it. But other than that, it's not going to be significant health hazard. But for landlords or property owners to cover their, behind, they have to disclose that.
Right, absolutely. And I think it is worth mentioning that in some cases, most of us are familiar with the Flint, Michigan crisis of lead pipes and water and children getting poisoned. And that is tragic and serious. And in no way do I ever want to say that, oh, don't even worry about lead anything. It's a problem, but it's not a problem for everyone and in every way. But bringing up the Flint situation, it is a good idea to have your water tested in an old house when you move in, or even before if you have an opportunity to find out what's in your water, especially with an old house. We had ours tested right away when we moved in and everything was fine. We're on city water. There are things that we don't love about city water, but it tested negative for lead, which means we didn't have pipes that were leaching lead into our water source.
That's a really good point. I didn't even think of that. I think with new construction, you don't worry about things like that. When I was living in Washington, D.C. in the early 2000s, it came out that a lot of city pipes, like water system, were actually lead pipes. So a lot of people's tap water had lead in them. That became like a citywide concern. And I remember at the time, the city, well, there, it's not like it can dug up every single pipe and replace everything, but their solution was to give everybody a Brita water filter. Supposedly, it will filter out 99% even heavy metals in the water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Flint, Michigan is sort of the face of this crisis right now, and they're having serious problems with their water, but it's not isolated to Flint, Michigan. I live also near a very big metropolitan area, and it's absolutely a concern. I think that the city that I live the nearest to has done, I think they're taking lessons from what's happened at Flint and taking care of things, but there will always be areas, unfortunately, that will slip through the cracks.
Right. To switch gear a bit, so what are some of the common mistakes or challenges that you see when newbies are working on their older homes?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess I should just go back to all my mistakes that I've made and come up with those. Sometimes we're a little too aggressive in the beginning. By aggressive, I mean, if you're removing something that you think you want to put back and we use the wrong tool and go in just a little too rough and end up breaking more things in the process. I think that's what we found in the beginning, was that sometimes as soon as we fix something, or in our effort to fix something, we were breaking something else. And that's part of the learning process. It would be great if we could all go in and just be perfect, but that's not a reality. So just planning for it, again, going back to that money thing, it's probably going to cost a little bit more money than you planned.
Right. And then what are some of the common mistakes or challenges that you see when newbies are working on their older homes?
I think it goes back to that focus, where they focus. A lot of people go right in and start wanting to make it prettier, as you mentioned before. And it's a worthwhile goal. It is your home and you want to feel comfortable and happy in that home. But I think that's probably one of the biggest mistakes that people do, is they rush right in and they start fixing things before they're really clear on the condition of their house sandwich, as my friend Scott says.
That's great. And in your opinion, do renovating and restoring older homes increase the property value?
Absolutely. And I love this question because that's so important. It absolutely does increase your property value, and sometimes even more than it would if you bought a newish construction home and then sold it 5, or 10 years later. Now, you are going to put a lot of money into it. So if you're the type of person who likes numbers and wants to know that and analyze all that, then absolutely, you're putting money in, but you're also getting money out. And it will increase the value of the home, because anything that looks nicer with all functioning systems in place will typically fetch a higher price than something that looks derelict.
Right. And I also think that it's the emotional return on investment as well. I find that people who are willing to buy older homes, it takes a very specific types of personality. It's because they appreciate the architecture details, they appreciate older homes, they appreciate the history behind it. And so for them to work on those homes, it also brings joy to them during the process.
That's absolutely correct. And I think, a realtor can go a long way to finding the right buyer for an old house. I think it's really common for realtors to go into an old house and just say, oh, and you can tear that out and tear that out and tear that out, trying to cater to the person who might want to do that too, but may not actually have the means to make that happen. So it's really important to kind of fit people together, the right buyer, the right house, the right realtor who might be willing to go in and say, there are changes that can be made, but look at this beautiful woodwork. Look at these pocket doors that still function. Look at these gorgeous old windows. Showing people the beauty of what they're getting.
Right. It's funny because I've been a long time renter and then I'm moving into a new place. This is the first time I chose like an all new construction. It was the lowest hanging fruit, but for me, I was just like, it lacks that kind of satisfaction to live in an older home where there's that histories and that details behind it. So,
Right.
and people often ask, is it worth renovating an old house versus tearing the whole thing down and rebuild? And what is your thought on this?
Hmm. So there are very few instances where, and that's not a decision, I guess, that people make by themselves. They have to have, there's codes involved and the city's involved. And, if you're talking about a historic district, then forget it. It's not going to happen unless you really lobby your town council or whatnot. But it's not a decision that the homeowner makes by themselves. And I've discovered that very rarely is a tear down the best option, even if the only thing you're leaving is the frame and the roof and the foundation. It just tends to be less expensive overall. And I mean, we're talking about, no house there, just framing, roof, construction. That tends to be the way that people go because that's all still intact.
Right. I agree with you. Health and safety is really the number one. So if people found something seriously wrong with the house, obviously they have to tear it down. But I think if, like you said, the framework is intact, they're actually going to save a lot of money instead of just level everything out.
For sure. And as soon as something's leveled, there's the expense of carting away everything, and then the site has to be completely redone. If you're getting a basement or if you're not getting a basement, it's both the cost of removing an old house plus the cost of building a new house. And it's an extra expense.
Right. And how do you take care of an older home?
Well, I mentioned before that on a yearly basis or during the year, I'm going around and sort of looking at everything with a critical eye and determining things that need to be fixed or repaired. A lot of old house problems are deferred maintenance problems. And everybody does it. We do it with our cars, we do it with our bodies, we do it with everything, deferred maintenance. But that deferred maintenance catches up maybe over 100 years, not with humans, gosh, we don't have that much time, but with a house, after 100 years, things start breaking. So it's just a good idea to go around and know what's working, what needs to be fixed, if there's something dire, making sure that you're just taking care of the systems, like your furnace, change your filters, just do it, just change your filters. All those things that we're supposed to do, try to do those things. That's just, like I said, we all do it, we all put off. But with an old house, those things can snowball, problems can snowball.
Right. And so knowing what you know now, is there anything that you would have done differently now that you've become more experienced in dealing with older homes?
Well, I know we're supposed to say, oh, yes, because I certainly am not perfect by any means. I guess I would have just wanted to know or to realize and understand that all of this takes time. And it's not going to happen quickly. It's going to take time and money, or patience and time and money and all of that. And just not rushing it. I think I kind of went into some projects with high expectations that didn't work out as planned. And later, revisiting those projects 3 or 4 years later, I realized, that I probably could have approached it in a different way.
Right. And I do have a question from a listener, Jessica.
Oh, yeah.
She asked, what is the best way to clean old wood floors?
Oh, well, it really depends on your surface. So if the coating is there, let's say there's shellac or that's a super old coating. I don't know. I'd have to know exactly the floor. But if you have something that's there that's coating the floor and making it somewhat shiny, then I would use probably just plain hot water, bucket, mop, whatever, with a little squirt of some gentle cleaner if you have some spots. A lot of these old houses don't actually have any finish on them at all. It's either worn off or it's, I don't know, over time, usually it's worn off. So in those places where the wood is bare, I wouldn't recommend any cleaners or really any water if you can avoid it. If spots spots are usually not a problem. It becomes more of a problem when you might have an upstairs that was never properly finished or something. And I get it, things get dirty. So just go easy on it. Something that will help your floors a lot is just a good, thorough vacuum or Swiffer or sweeping, and keeping up on that will help a lot to prevent scratches in the floor. We bring in things, and if you keep that vacuumed up and Swiffered up, then you aren't making scratches in the floor.
So I have a follow-up question with that. So if you have older floor, would you recommend having a coating on top just to protect it?
Yeah, that's a very important thing to have on your floor, but what kind of coating you choose is kind of up for grabs. So a modern product that almost everyone uses is polyurethane. It comes very shiny, or it comes in a satin finish, which has a less sheen. Old houses generally, at the very beginning when these houses were built, their floors were not shiny. Usually they were bare and they were waxed. So this has kind of evolved over time. I chose something for our floor that was actually an oil finish that, I know it sounds bad because it's oil, but it becomes a part of the wood. So it's a completely matte finish, but it's waterproof, water resistant. So if we come in and, if I drop water on it, it beads up and everything. I kind of veered off your question. So the point is, yes, you need to protect your floors with some sort of coating, but what you put on it is somewhat a matter of personal taste and the aesthetic that you're going for.
That's great. I'm also intrigued by your wax finish though. So how often do you have to maintain and redo the whole finish?
So I guess maybe I didn't make that clear. I do not have wax because I have a life. And I don't want to sit at home waxing my floors. I guess, when wax floors were a thing, people did wax floors, that was I don't know how often they did it, but a lot of times there was, staff, that was their job to keep the floors looking nice and waxed. So that's something I also do not have, the staff to keep my floors clean. What evolved from there was, of course, the wife who stayed home, who her job and responsibilities were to care for the home and make it beautiful. So I don't know the exact, I would suggest, or I would, there was wax buildup, so they had to get that off, and then they had to re-wax and buff and shine and all that. So I have what's called an oil finish, and it's a modern product. It's that product I mentioned before that was, I believe, created in Belgium. And it actually soaks into the wood and becomes a part of the wood. So I don't really have to do, and I chose it for the very reason that it's almost maintenance free. So I just have to keep the floors I just keep them swept, and they provide a floor cleaner, but I just use water to clean it. We usually don't wear shoes in our house. I have a robot vacuum, and I love that thing. I love that thing. It keeps our floors so nice. That's my modern convenience that I have really gotten used to.
That's great. Yeah, I misspoke. I meant to say oil finish, and I said wax. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. And the product is actually designed to repair very easily. So if I get a deep scratch, for instance, they have a method at a product to get that out that merges perfectly with the product that's there so that you can't see those repairs. And that's something that polyurethane simply cannot do. If you have a problem with your polyurethane floor and you need to repair it, you'll almost always see that repair mark.
Yeah, unless you resand the whole thing and then redo it.
Right. Exactly.
My mom does her own polyurethane on the floor, so I know how that process goes. It's usually very messy. Yeah.
Yeah. And it is beautiful, but, we're talking about floors. Again, I keep going back to this. Our floor is 135 years old. You can't sand a floor like that forever. It's not a renewable resource. It's a floor with only a certain amount of height above that tongue and groove, and it can only withstand so many refinishes. So that was another reason why I chose the coating that I did, because this was a one and done. I would never have to resand everything completely again.
That's great. That's fantastic. And my last question for you is, what is the number one tip you'll give to homeowners when it comes to renovating their old homes?
Gosh, I probably should have thought about this question more, huh? I had these in advance, but I was like, just one tip. Let's see. I would say, don't be afraid of the hazards that you might encounter in your old home. Do some research, know and create a plan of what you would do if you find something that's hazardous, but don't let that keep you up at night.
That's great. Thank you so much for being on the show. It was such a pleasure talking to you. You're just so knowledgeable about everything. I love
Oh,
it.
thank you. Thank you for having me, Cindy. This was really fun. I have never been a guest on somebody else's podcast, so it's been great.
You're super knowledgeable, so I think you're perfect. Yeah, totally. It was great.
Thank you. Thank you.
So that's it for today's show. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to help and support the show, there are 3 ways to do so. You can leave a review and rating on iTunes. You can share the show on social media, or you can donate to support the maintaining costs for the podcast. You can make a donation through the show notes or on the sidebar of our site. If you haven't left a review on iTunes, please do so. This will help us grow the show and book more guests. If you have any questions, feedback, and suggestions, you can comment on the show notes. You can also find the show notes by going to stagemore.com/podcast. That's it. Have a fantastic week and happy staging.